The corporation is perhaps one of the most important institutions in our lives. It's in many respects more important than the state or religion. It's something that is clothing us, feeding us and housing us. It employs us and invests our savings. It's the source of immense economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But it's also been a cause of terrible deprivation and poverty. And understanding why it's been such a success and such a failure at the same time is very important to understanding our well-being and economic prosperity, but we know very little about it. The financial crisis, it's a good example of how institutions that are just focused on one objective, namely maximising the interests of their shareholders, can undermine so many parts of society. In the case of banks, it was they were pursuing shareholder interests at the expense of you and I as depositors in banks and bondholders. They wanted banks to take risks. We as depositors wanted them to be safe and sound. And ultimately it was the taxpayer in society who had to bail them out. So that's a very good illustration. Corporations should take responsibility for their own actions. At the moment what happens is they do what they think is in their own interest or their shareholders' interest until someone tells them to stop. They should be controlled by long-term shareholders. At the moment there's a dominance by very short-term shareholders. They should have clearly articulated values, okay? So they don't need to just act in the interests of their shareholders, they can act in the interests of you and I as customers or employees or communities more generally. Someone needs to take responsibility for those actions. That should be the board of the companies. They ultimately should take responsibility if the company fails to uphold what it says it's going to do. Regulation should enforce violations of public law like bribery and corruption much more stringently than at present. Regulation should protect our systems, like our environmental systems and our financial systems. But elsewhere, regulation should be less intrusive and meddlesome. Instead, we should use the tax system as a way of aligning the interests of companies with society more generally. And finally, we should be educating future leaders in the purposes and values of corporations so that when they go out to become leaders and owners of corporations, they have a notion as to what their roles and responsibilities as well as their rights and rewards are. This is not just about getting companies to promote economic efficiency. It's about companies as moral entities. Now, it might seem to you that thinking about commercially oriented institutions as moral entities is a contradiction in terms, but it's not. It's not, because they're very good instruments for committing in the ways in which you and I find it very difficult to commit. And two cases that illustrate that very well are Lehman Brothers and Barclays Bank. Not the Lehman Brothers and Barclays Bank of today, but their 19th and 17th century versions respectively. Mayor Lehman, who founded Lehman Brothers, would take his children every weekend to the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York to show them the plight of worse-off members of society. John Freem, who founded Barclays Bank in 1692, wrote Scripture Instruction, which was a text that was used in Quaker schools for more than 100 years. So those companies were founded by founders with very strong ethical principles, but they've become owned by dispersed owners and executives who are interested in one thing and one thing alone, that's making money. And I'll give you an illustration of this. So Bob Diamond, who was chief executive of Barclays Bank, was called before a parliamentary committee shortly after he resigned. And he could answer all of the questions that were posed to him, all of the questions except for one, which came from a member of the committee, John Mann, who said to him, "Can you remind us, Mr. Diamond, what are the three founding principles that the Quakers who set up Barclays Bank established as the principles of Barclays Bank?" And Bob Diamond muttered, "I can't." And John Mann said, "Well, I can help you, and I can help tattoo them on the knuckles of your hand, because they were honesty, integrity, and plain dealing." Now, restoring trust in corporations is, I think, the most important issue of this decade, because without it, economic systems will go on failing, financial systems will go on collapsing, and the environment will go on degrading. With it, we can create much greater degrees, not just of prosperity, but well-being more generally. Because ultimately, to my mind, moral corporations are commercially successful corporations, And the competitiveness of nations depends on the moral fibre of its corporations.